Yeah.
Are you going to hit continue? Okay. Today we have the unique pleasure to be in conversation with Nick Schou. Nick is an award-winning investigative journalist.
Sorry, I should have said it's actually pronounced
Schou.
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 Yeah.
All right. Well, we can edit that out. Schou. You know, and I thought to ask you about that because I thought shoe like shoe or Schou like Schou. Schou. Got it.
That's probably not even the right pronunciation, but that's what our family goes with.
What kind of a name is that?
It's like originally Dutch, but like my grandfather emigrated from Norway, so there's Norwegians and Danes. It's a no one claims it. You can't go anywhere and have people say, "Oh yeah, it's from here."
Well, good. I'm glad you stopped that. All right. Okay. Okay. Today we have the unique pleasure to be in conversation with Nick Schou. Nick is an award-winning investigative journalist with over 25 years of experience in print media. He has articles resulted in the release from prison of wrongly convicted individuals and in the federal indictment and conviction and imprisonment of Mayor Pamela Julian Hoshin of Huntington Beach, California, for her role in a condo conversion scam, which robbed the city of substantial amounts of low-income housing and put a number of city residents in financial hardships. Nick is also the former editor of the chief of the OC Weekly, Southern California source of news and entertainment. He is also the author of several books, which we'll be discussing today on national security, the media, and the war on drugs, including Orange Sunshine, Weed Runners. His 2006 book, Kill the Messenger, tells the story of the tragic death of Gary Webb, who was the former San Jose Mercury news reporter whose 1996 Dark Alliance series on the CIA crack cocaine connection created a firestorm of controversy and led to his resignation from the paper amid escalating attacks on his person and his work by mainstream media, and ultimately, sadly, led to his suicide in December of 2004. Kill the Messenger was then made into a 2014 Hollywood feature starring Jeremy Renner. Schou has also worked as a story producer for the 2017 History Channel series on the U.S. war on drugs and the 2019 Netflix European documentary on the Sinaloa cartel. His latest book is Spooked: How the CIA Manipulates the Media and Hoodwinked Hollywood, and directly addresses all of the works we have in one way or another, the lengths our government will go to suppress what it wishes to hide and to propagate the lies it wishes you to believe. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Now, can you briefly tell us what it was that Gary Webb uncovered and correspondingly what he didn't uncover and state in Dark Alliance? And do you see any connections or similarities between the kind of censorship Webb faced to what is happening to Julian Assange now?
Sure. Gary Webb was an investigative reporter with the San Jose Mercury News, and his series Dark Alliance in 1996 was the first time that a major newspaper had published an expose online. And the expose was about the connection between the crack epidemic and the CIA's 1980s war in Nicaragua against the Sandinista government. He uncovered that Freeway Ricky Ross, who was a legendary drug dealer in Los Angeles, who the LA Times had called the kingpin of crack cocaine, had actually been supplied by Nicaraguans that were working with the CIA and had apparently been protected by them. And this was an explosive series, in part because of the African-American community reading it online and demanding answers. And so it led to a congressional investigation. But by the time that happened, the major newspapers reacted to Gary Webb's reporting by dismissing his claims. And in part, what they did was focus on claims that he didn't make, which is a process that's very familiar to people that have seen how the government and the media often deal with whistleblowers. And so in this case, what the mainstream media focused on was the allegation not included in Webb's reporting that the CIA had invented crack cocaine, that the CIA had somehow deliberately spread crack cocaine throughout inner cities in America. Now, it's important to understand that this was something that many African-American people had been aware of in terms of some sort of lack of accountability by the government as to what was happening in the inner cities in the 1980s. There was a huge explosion of violence And basically, the crack cocaine epidemic decimated an entire generation of people in the inner cities, and it was extremely painful. Also, there were a lot of questions that weren't being answered, such as how exactly do these drugs end up here? And the connection between the drug sales in the inner cities and the supply side of the question in Latin America, Colombia, Central America had never really been completely solved. Webb actually did make a major advancement in answering that question by revealing the extent to which the CIA had turned a blind eye to the activity of people it was working with in the so-called fight against communism in the 1980s. And that is that after Webb's series came out, after the mainstream media operating basically with anonymous sources in the government, including the CIA, trying to discredit him, the CIA then turned around because of the political pressure, thanks to the African-American community by and large, released a report admitting that for 10 years, actually more like 15 years, the agency had a formal agreement, a legal agreement with the Justice Department stating that it would not report drug dealing activities and other crimes by people it was working with. And this was a much broader scandal than Gary Webb had reported.
And the reason for my question, framing what he said and what he didn't say, is he was vilified thereafter. Why do you believe the mainstream press came so hard at him after initially praising? He won awards for his article. The word you used in 3 of your books is controversialize. Why was he made so controversial, do you believe?
Well, I think Gary Webb, when he broke his story, he actually was very idealistic about how the press would react. He actually thought that given the explosive nature of the allegations and given the power of the press in this country, that they would actually continue digging into this story and get to the bottom of it. And instead, what happened was the exact opposite of that. And so in writing Kill the Messenger, I tried to excavate the series and how Gary Webb worked on it for a year, how, because it was a paper that was smaller than the LA Times and New York Times and Washington Post and didn't have the access to power that those did, it was viewed dismissively, I think, by the elite media, first of all. Who is the San Jose Mercury News to make these allegations, particularly the LA Times? Like I said, in 1994, 2 years before Webb's story came out, they had elevated Freeway Rick Ross to the level of a kingpin, wrote about, his travails in the justice system. Mind you, it's very ironic to note that Freeway Rick Ross, as big as he was, he was actually put away in prison for life because of his drug dealing by his actual supplier, who was a government informant and who did very little time in prison at all. And that was another aspect of Gary Webb's story that was very shocking. However, the meat of what happened is that when Webb's story came out, the media did what it kind of always does with these things. It tries to explain its spotty record on these types of stories by trying to say that what was new in Gary's story wasn't true and what was true wasn't new, so to speak. This was actually something that one of the LA Times editors who supervised this massive attack on his reporting said. And this just goes to the very bizarre relationship between the elite media and the center of power in Washington, D.C., which is that when you look back at the actual investigations that these papers supposedly did in the 1980s on the CIA Contra drug issue, they hardly did anything at all. And to the extent that people in power, such as Senator John Kerry at the time, future presidential candidate, had hearings that were looking into this, some of which was classified. So it was a little bit murky, but these newspapers were well aware that there was a lot more going on than they were reporting. When Gary Webb came and started connecting all these dots, they tried to act like this wasn't new. But when you look back all along, to the extent that people such as Gary Webb, such as John Kerry, tried to actually get answers to this, they were all alternately ignored or ridiculed by the elite media.
So he was a whistleblower, essentially highlighting something that the public should have known about what was being done in their name and with their tax dollars. How do you see this relating to the ongoing prosecution of Julian Assange?
Well, the Julian Assange case is like an epic example of the failure of the media to do its job. And so I think that he basically was the first major whistleblower in the contemporary era of new journalism, so to speak, of of new forms of technology aided by the internet, enabling whistleblowers to actually circumvent the media's control over what Americans see and hear, and not just Americans, but across the world. And so with WikiLeaks, this was the first time that you had a major, national security story coming out from a source that wasn't an elite player on the media landscape. And so Julian Assange was the first example. Ed Snowden, Chelsea Manning, other whistleblowers came later, of people that felt it was their duty to try to get information out to the public that they were being denied and that was being covered up by the government. And they knew that if they simply handed this to the elite media, that it would not actually get reported. As I explore in Spook, there are many examples of the New York Times, Washington Post in particular, these two papers sitting on stories of national significance, whether it has to do with illegal surveillance, whether it has to do with elite espionage, that affects the constitutional rights of both Americans and people around the world, and human rights in general. They sit on these stories for political reasons. And so Assange was somebody that just tried to circumvent this, and he paid the price, because ultimately the media enabled a campaign of controversialization, of discrediting, foisted by the US government, particularly by the national security apparatus, to try to focus on Assange himself rather than the material that he was providing, and to try to make him the story. And this is exactly what most people think of when they think of Julian Assange. He's a controversial character. He's possibly a rapist. He's somebody that looks haggard and bizarre in pictures that you see on the internet. Now, this is all straight out of the CIA playbook of how to try to discredit a whistleblower.
And do you see a similarity between the way that Webb was controversialized and the way that Julian Assange was? Julian Assange persecution essentially began with the release of the collateral murder video, where they show 3 verifiable war crimes committed by US troops. He was left alone for quite a long time, but after that, the rape charges emerged, the prosecution by Interpol. Do you see similarities between that controversialization between Webb and Assange?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I delve into this in Kill the Messenger. That is Gary Webb, ultimately lost his career because of the Dark Alliance story. And in the process, his not just the Dark Alliance story was being attacked by the elite media, but also his entire career. You had a team of reporters across the country essentially being assigned the task of trying to discredit this reporter, digging into his previous work decades earlier at other smaller newspapers, and investigating allegations that came out of the prosecution of Freeway Ricky Ross, that somehow Gary Webb, by attending the trial and by actually covering the controversial nature of this prosecution, where you had, again, paid government informants who had supplied Freeway Ricky Ross testifying against him, that somehow he was, working on a Hollywood script or some way trying to subvert the justice system. And so it completely worked. Gary Webb's career in journalism was ruined. I think the same thing happened with Julian Assange, but as recent revelations have made clear, it's even more serious. In the sense that there have been on the record statements now coming out of the CIA showing that they looked into the possibility of trying to actually assassinate Julian Assange. So this is an extreme example of the lengths to which the national security state is willing to go in terms of exploring how to discredit or ultimately neutralize a whistleblower.
Well, the fact that the government is out to get you, they have a vested interest to protect their secrets. I'm curious, you've noted that both all the New York Times, the Washington Post, but particularly the Los Angeles Times attacked him with a level of vitriol that's surprising. I am curious, why do you believe the Los Angeles Times, more so than both the New York and the Post, not only vilified him so horribly, but even after his suicide, continued to do so?
Yeah, this is something that actually inspired me to write the book, Kill the Messenger. That title of the book and also the movie came from an obituary I wrote for Gary Webb. And that was inspired by the obituary that I read in the LA Times back page of the local section of the paper, where it basically described him as an author of a discredited series on the CIA and crack cocaine, and seemed to be consigning Gary Webb to this sort of minor footnote of journalistic scandal. The fact is, and this came out ultimately, I think, as a result of Hollywood's willingness to make a movie about this, have forced the LA Times to a certain degree to re-examine its history on this. And among other things, I was able to interview Jesse Katz, who was the reporter of the series of articles that made Freeway Rick Ross into the drug celebrity that he was. And then when Gary Webb's Dark Alliance story came along, he was given the task of flying back from Texas, where he was reporting for the paper, to rewrite the story on Freeway Rick Ross and explain how no, Freeway Rick was not such a big player in the crack trade. After all, he was just one of many players in a very complicated world, so to speak. And so Jesse Katz, when the movie came out, finally admitted his shame in having written about that. And in its review of the film, the LA Times, for the first time, and I feel this is a little bit too little too late, admitted that they had actually, unfairly tried to discredit a story that they should have actually reported themselves. I mean, again, I think the main factor here was journalistic envy. You had a competing newspaper, the Mercury News, scooping the LA Times in its own backyard, revealing the massive CIA cover up involving the source of the drugs that this major crack player had been distributing on the streets of Los Angeles. Now, if it wasn't for Congresswoman Maxine Waters, for example, a lot of the information that came out after Dark Alliance, and I was a reporter at the time, and I actually got a hold of these files. She had to actually go to the LA Sheriff's Department and demand that they personally hand these files over to her. They were insisting they didn't have files on this major crack ring that Rick Ross was a part of. But as a result of Gary Webb's reporting and the bravery of Congresswoman Waters at the time, the press was able to access this. Again, they didn't do much with that material, but that material that did get released did show that there was a multi-agency task force assigned to trying to take down the Freeway Rick Ross network, that it was going up against a lot of very protected players, that there were allegations at the time, well before Gary Webb came along and said anything about this, that the CIA was involved with this drug ring.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Maxine Waters, because she had a great deal to say about the series. But I'm curious, this is America. Race is central to everything. The fact that the crack epidemic decimated I'm talking to you from Pasadena, California. We were affected here, as was Los Angeles County, all the way down to San Pedro. What part do you believe race played in this, in the vilification of Gary Webb, the trouble with the story, what have you?
Well, all you have to do is look at part 3 of the 3-part response to Gary Webb's story that came out in the LA Times. One whole newspaper edition came out just trying to basically patronize the African American community by asking the question, why is the African American community so likely to believe in conspiracy theories? And so, I think it's just highly offensive, and it has everything to do with race. First of all, the Gary Webb Dark Alliance story didn't just expose government complicity and the turning of a blind eye, which obviously raises the question of, how much did the government value the lives of the people that were being affected by all this? But it also showed that the way the justice system responded to the crack epidemic was entirely corrupt, where you had mostly young African American men being put away with these extreme sentences for relatively small amounts of crack cocaine, while their counterparts higher up the distribution system, who tended not to be African American, who were caught dealing much larger quantities of powder cocaine that was turned into crack, were doing much less prison time or becoming government informants. So the whole justice system, when it comes to the war on drugs, is stacked, against poor African-American people when you look at it through the lens, especially of the CIA crack cocaine scandal. It's corrupt, it's unfair, it's something that has never been completely addressed or redressed, and it demands justice, I think, even today. This war on drugs continues and continues to mostly seem to operate to extend itself as a way of trying to imprison large amounts of people, whereas the suppliers, and also we're talking now through the lens of the opioid crisis, these are pharmaceutical companies that have been shown to have been aware of the addictive nature of the drugs that they sell for massive profits, escape, prosecution and escape scrutiny.
Well, you highlighted perhaps the most ironic reversal of racism when Daniel Blandon, the supplier for Ricky Ross, was actually the one who testified against him. Ricky went to jail and Daniel walked.
Yeah, and again, Danilo Blandon himself was just a supplier that worked under another character, Norwin Meneses, who was a Contra fundraiser who got his picture taken with the CIA's handpicked leader of the Nicaraguan Contras in San Francisco during the 1980s, at the same time that the DEA was investigating him for supervising massive shipments of Colombian cocaine to the Bay Area. And so, this is a really interesting case where you had frogmen that were literally caught red-handed with bales of cocaine from a Colombian freighter trying to scramble onto a pier in San Francisco, and the CIA sent one of its lawyers to try to retrieve money that the DEA had seized in this case, claiming that it wasn't drug money, but rather bona fide Nicaraguan Contra support aid. So that was something that was never revealed at the time. When the DEA raid happened, when the media wrote about this so-called frogman case, but only came out as a result of Gary Webb's reporting when the CIA finally had to issue its report owning up to what it had covered up during the 1980s.
This seems to be across the board, and your book title, Kill a Messenger, seems apt, because if we look at Jeffrey Sterling, John Kiriakou, John Drake, and Julian Assange, and obviously Gary Webb's, highlighting the crimes and malfeasance of our country, the people that are highlighted don't end up going to jail. It is the messenger who is generally killed. Why would you say that is in the United States?
Well, the United States, I think, has an epic problem when it comes to the war on terror, when it comes to the war on drugs. These are the two longest wars in our country's history so far. And together, they have enabled a situation where the American public has largely been sold the notion that we should live in a constant state of fear. And so the ability of the national security apparatus to operate in secrecy is vital to both the war on terror and the war on drugs. And so when you have whistleblowers that come from the government, people like John Kiriakou, admitting, that the CIA was involved in torture, for example, they're the ones that ended up being prosecuted rather than any of the individuals alleged to have actually tortured anybody. So that's just, an extremely important fact to note about whistleblowers in the age of the war on terror, is that they are the ones that pay the price for this, whether it's Julian Assange, Ed Snowden, in terms of the media attacks and the disinformation campaigns that go against them. And then when it comes to actual government whistleblowers, Chelsea Manning, John Kiriakou, whistleblowers are the only people that pay the price. Again, there is, as you mentioned, a direct tie to media whistleblowers such as Webb, who pay, a deadly price for trying to tell the truth to the American public at the expense of their own careers and ultimately at the expense of their lives.
In the opening of Kill a Messenger, to go back to Maxine Waters for a minute, she said something that I think is prescient. She said that history will judge him, not current times. And so I'd like you to look at all these whistleblowers, some of which you just mentioned yourself, and ask you and tell us, how do you believe history in the long term is going to judge Gary Webb, Snowden, obviously Julian Assange, John Kiriakou, and all the other people that put their lives and everything they own on the line to tell the public what the government doesn't want us to know?
Well, there's an expression, truth will out. And I think, it's interesting to me. I'm not objective about this. I am an investigative reporter. I knew Gary Webb. I knew him when he was a celebrity. I, knew him and was working closely with him through the process in which his career was ruined. And I saw firsthand on a personal level how this affected him. But I know that he never wavered in his commitment to trying to get this story out and never regretted it, which is an amazing thing. And I know that he asked himself, and he even wrote about this, that he wanted to examine his conscience, at a point much later on and be able to look back and know that he did the right thing. And I think that that's something that's extremely important, whether you're, a whistleblower in the government, whether you're an investigative reporter or somebody that's considering a career in investigative reporting. You have to have a willingness to tell the truth. You have to be determined and dogged in order to get the truth out. And you have to be able to believe that history will look back on the efforts that you've made kindly, because it will. Ultimately, the truth has just a tenacious tendency to not go away, and people want to know the truth. People want answers to the questions that are being covered up and kept away from them. And that search will never end. In history, I think, will ultimately, as Maxine Waters and other people have said, be the judge.
Well, as an investigative journalist, I'm curious. When I was growing up, there were three networks: NBC, CBS, and ABC, but there were a plethora of news outlets, and they were owned by many, many, many different corporations. Today, there are 6 multinational corporations that own all of our newslets in every fashion. So my question is, in the 24 years since the Dark Alliance first appeared, how do you feel the investigative journalism landscape has changed? Do you believe it for the better? Do you believe it for the worse? Is there a future for it? For folks like Julian and all of the other whistleblowers out there to get the stories the government wants to suppress out?
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, the newspaper that I worked at for 25 years, roughly, OC Weekly, no longer exists, as many alt weeklies as well have fallen victim to the lack of investment in independent investigative reporting in this country. So, at the same time, however, the internet came around very early in my career, and it has helped actually ensure that stories that might have been harder to find out about, harder to get out there, easier to cover up, easier to ignore, will never go away. It's all out there. That information is there to stay. And I think that the internet has also made it possible for independent sources of investigative material to circumvent the manufacturing of consent, as Noam Chomsky would put it, that has existed in the media landscape for so long. And so I'm actually very optimistic about this. I look at the nonprofit model of grant-based reporting at a local level as something that's extremely important to look at. ProPublica is another very good example of how the nonprofit model can work and should work. I think that investigative journalism in this country should be looked at as a public good. It cannot be something that is left victim to the whims of corporate profiteering, and that model's broken. It just doesn't exist. And there's a premium, I think, in this country on independent investigation being something that continues to sort of drive the narrative in terms of the search for answers, the search for truth in this country and in this world. But it's something that just isn't being invested in. And so it's incumbent, I believe, on people that are able to spread the word about the need for strong independent journalism in this country, to try to work together to create a better media landscape that isn't something that is driven by profit, but rather driven by the sense of search for truth and justice.
Yeah, I'd like to drill a little bit down on Julian Assange in particular. There have been two bombshells that have come out, which I'm sure you're well aware of. The first came out in Stunden, I believe it's a Norwegian newspaper, that the chief witness for the FBI against Julian Assange, who had said that he had helped him hack, turned out to be a convicted pedophile and scammer, and said that what he told the FBI were lies. That story came out, I believe, a little over a month, 2 months ago, and has vaporized. And then, of course, the bombshell that Mike Pompeo and the CIA had considered the option of assassinating, kidnapping, having running gun battles in downtown London. What do you feel? Why do you feel that even though, and this could fade as well, why is it that Julian Assange still languishes, not having been convicted of nothing, in Balmash prison? If you take his time in the Ecuadorian embassy, he has been in solitary confinement for well over a decade, and he's been convicted of nothing. Why do you believe that is?
I don't know. When it comes to Pompeo, I mean, that boggles the mind. It really boggles the mind to think of how idiotic it would be to try to assassinate Julian Assange. I mean, that would just basically ruin the until now very effective disinformation and controversialization campaign, and would turn him into a martyr, which to a certain extent he already is. But that said, what's important for people to understand is, despite these Trumpian excesses, there's by and large a very bipartisan view about how to handle whistleblowers, and you never give up the prosecution. And if you look at the previous administrations, in the Biden administration, the Obama administration, Clinton administration, Bush, they're all the same when it comes to this. In fact, if anything, each successive administration since 9/11 has only just doubled down on the level of prosecution against whistleblowers. It's expanded exponentially. And so, again, in this day and age, in the internet era, the national security state depends on secrecy, and it will fight to protect that at any cost. Although I have to say, the level to which it seems that the CIA under Trump had its had the mittens taken off here when it came to their approach to treating whistleblowers is just absolutely astounding. And again, the problem is that in this era, in the post-Trump era, almost anything starts seeming normal after a while.
Well, that's odd, because the Obama administration, which was no friend to whistleblowers, they prosecuted more whistleblowers using the Espionage Act than all other administrations combined.
That's correct.
But they correctly divined what they referred to as the New York Times problem, that if they were able to take and successfully prosecute Julian Assange, any journal of note, anybody that comes into contact with the type of documents that you would see, whether directly by searching out or received by accident or just in a dead drop, would become radioactive, and anybody could be convicted. I have two questions. Why do you believe the Biden administration is following through when the Obama administration wisely saw this for the problem it is? And the second thing is, what about the appalling silence of the Fourth Estate, which stands to lose most should Julian be convicted?
These controversialization campaigns are very effective. You have to understand, I mean, again, in the public perception at this point, that perception war has already been won. To a certain extent, Assange has already been tainted with this controversial notion of not being a whistleblower, but somehow being a national security threat to the United States. I mean, if he was an American citizen, he would have been charged with treason, presumably. And so this is something that, the media has by and large sat on its thumbs and I look at this in spook, not just with the Assange story, but just with many other examples of stories where aggressive reporters that that work for the elite media come across these very important stories, and then the newspaper basically sits on it, refuses to publish it under threats from the CIA or from various presidential administrations saying, this is, if you release this information, it would be a threat to national security. And so the whole theme of Spooked is how effective this broad campaign has been with these elite media players, and how all too often they are just playing along with this in order to maintain the access to power that they have. It's a very sordid relationship, and as important and vital as the media, and especially investigative reporting organizations are in this country, it's a sort of a dirty secret within the mainstream press that they do rely on the government and on the national security state in order to maintain sources and access to people that will allow them to constantly break stories and win major prizes, but at the expense of going after much more difficult material, which is all too often viewed as a threat to security, not just by the security state, but by the media itself. They're part of this entire system. They're not separate from it completely.
Well, I guess the wonder of WikiLeaks was that it developed a way for people who were whistleblowers to safely and securely provide them with data. I know that he'd been vilified. Friends of mine, liberal Democrats, say, well, when he goes after the Republicans without then I'll defend him, but not now, because he went out of his way to tank Hillary Clinton, which is a failure to understand how WikiLeaks works, that they don't go after things, they wait for things to come to them. Which brings me to my next question. The mainstream media has always been problematic. If I think of Ida Tarbell, if I think of I.F. Stone or Seymour Hersh, someone who is an incredible reporter, but I hear is not a very nice guy. But each one of these people have found a way to work outside the main framework of the corporate media, is what we like to refer to it these days. Now, as an investigative journalist yourself, how do you see yourself moving in the future landscape with people like Julian and all of these other whistleblowers? How do you see your job morphing?
Well, I think there's a saying in journalism, and this is something that just exists in a general sense outside of everything we're talking about, but it's also quite relevant. You're only as good as your last story. Investigative reporters are essentially a breed unto themselves. You're always trying to find out something that people don't know about and figure out how to prove it and how to write that story. It's an exciting, challenging career. And so again, with my own particular bias for always trying to write stories that do this, the work is its own reward. The question is just how to make a living doing it. I'm in my 50s now. I'm still able to do it. But I mean, I look at the experience of Gary Webb. I look at the experience of reporters such as Bob Perry, also who passed away, but who I knew quite well, and other reporters that put their careers on the lines. And I find, in a strange way, the experience of these people, while in some ways, with like Gary Webb being a very clear example, very tragic outcomes, I still find inspiration in the courage that these people had. And so for me, it just underscores exactly how much is at stake and how important this work is. And so that basic drive that guides investigative journalists is something, I don't know if you're born with it, but it never goes away once you make that your path.
I'd like to close on a more general question, and that regards censorship. Look, the ultimate form of censorship is death, to kill the messenger, as you correctly said. And certainly that was the case for Gary Webb. Now, he wasn't killed, he killed himself, but he was driven to that. And I think so, sadly, incredibly sadly, I think the world lost an incredible reporter when they lost Gary Webb. But the next worst form of censorship is imprisonment. And that's where Julian Assange sits right now. And when I think of the level of heroism of Chelsea Manning, when she was asked to perjure herself and then re-sent to prison, appearing before a grand jury. I'm just curious what you think the censorship landscape looks like moving forward with the ongoing prosecution of whistleblowers.
I think this really needs to be the focus of any any effort to understand the answer to that question. You have to look at how these whistleblower cases are handled, and you have to look at the potential impact that these cases have, not just on the whistleblowers themselves, but on any reporter that dares to get involved with the dissemination of information that could, in some ways, put themselves at risk of prosecution and of not just censorship, but criminal prosecution. The First Amendment protections that reporters have, while strong, is under constant threat by the U.S. government on these types of stories. And so, as James Risen, formerly of the New York Times, who wrote these brilliant stories that the paper sat on and then ultimately published, in one case only when they knew that his book was coming out and that his book would scoop his own newspaper because they had allowed this to happen, and who ended up at The Intercept. He told me, and spooked, and I find it a very fitting way to cap this entire narrative, is that the national security state is basically drunk on its own success at this point, and it has Americans living in a constant fear of things, largely the wrong things, in terms of terrorism and in terms of anything that distracts the American public from what it's actually at risk of losing, which is their freedom. So, when it comes to whistleblowers like Julian Assange, Ed Snowden, John Kiriakou, Gary Webb, all these stories are very important examples of the importance of trying to preserve the search for truth in this country, because our very freedoms, are at risk of being lost, especially after 9/11, in a way never seen before. And this story continues today.
Gary Webb, I want to thank you very, very much. This has been an incredible interview, and I thank you very much for your writing and for the great books you've put out. And I would encourage anybody that hasn't read them, read them, because they read almost like fiction, because sometimes the truth is harder to believe than fiction itself. So thank you very much, Gary.
It's Nick, actually. But
oh my God, Jesus.
We might have to redo the end of that.
We might have to redo the end of it.
I wasn't going to say anything at first. It's an honor to be confused with Gary.
Gary, oh my God, Jesus. That's why they call it dope, Nick. What can I say?
You let me know.